Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This is an episode I've been thinking about for a while, and I've found myself making so many notes and reading so many additional books in order to prepare for it that I figured it was time I just try to get some words down on tape. So maybe the best place to start would be with this poem from Poems Beautiful and Useful. A little selection edited by Victoria Moul from Headless Poet Press. I apologize, I have sounded like Slavoj Žižek for the last couple episodes because I've got such a persistent head cold. So I'm sniffing like crazy. All right, so on her first appearance on the show, Victoria recited from memory this little poem that her father had taught her as a girl. And it's usually anthologized under the title To Lucasta, Going to the Wars. It's by Richard Lovelace. It's a little tiny 12-line poem. She includes it in her pamphlet, Poems Beautiful and Useful, without a title. None of the poems have titles except for, I think there are a couple of psalm translations by the Sidney siblings. But she's, I think, following the convention of the time and letting the titles go sort of unsaid or allowing them to be repurposed for new contexts and new audiences. But this poem, it's very beautiful. It's very memorable. It is, as I said, it's included in this pamphlet, the title of which is Poems Beautiful and Useful. That phrase is a sort of translation from Horace's, what's the dulce, util, dulce et util, or util dulce, something like that in Latin, useful and sweet. He says in the Ars Poetica, the letter to some guy's schmuck's son. I forget who it is. He's writing an epistle to saying, oh, so you want to be a poet, motherfucker. And that's where the phrase comes from, beautiful and useful and sweet. Is Frost the one who puts the phrases it as delight and instruct? But this is an old idea. As I said, I think it's a good title for the pamphlet, but I don't think it's really actually descriptive. Because while this poem is definitely quite sweet and I think psychologically insightful, I don't think it's useful in the sense that maybe Lovelace thought it was, or readers at the time thought it was, or maybe Victoria. I don't know. I think Victoria and I see the uses of poetry in slightly different terms. But I thought I would start here. So this is usually anthologized as To Lucasta, Going to the Wars. As becomes clear, Lucasta is not the one going to the wars. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more. That paradox, this inconstancy, right, this faithlessness, I'm going to cheat on you with a new mistress, but it is such that you will adore my inconstancy. You will adore my faithlessness to you, because it's honor. Honor is really his true love, and that facilitates his love for this Lucasta. I think the ostensible use of this poem is to instruct readers to pursue honor. It certainly gives a great, glorious, and romantic gloss to honor. It suggests that honor is the higher good, and it's so good, in fact, that it should make you leave the chaste breast and quiet mind of your mistress. A chaste breast, is that? I guess he means chaste as in one of two things. Either chaste because chaste does not, again, mean celibate. It means sexually moral, so she's sexually moral by giving her chaste breast only to him, or, also plausible, she's sexually moral by giving her chaste breast only to her husband, though the speaker / Lovelace is so in love with her. Seems probably more in keeping with the chivalric tradition of unconsummated adultery, or I guess like periodically consummated adultery. But yeah, if there's an instruction, if there's a use, it would seem to be to guide the reader toward honor, or to guide even the young women who are not at this point going out into battle to accept their male lovers' choice to pursue glorious martial conflict rather than sexual gratification. And I think that's fine as much uses. I mean, I don't know. I think that's fine as uses go. It's very convincing in the poem. It very much, it feels true when you read it. And it certainly feels as if the speaker thinks it's true, right? This is part of what a good dramatic monologue does. It puts you in the mind of the person who believes this thing, and it allows you to experience that with him. I don't know if, broadly speaking, it's a great piece of advice, because, there are a lot of bad military causes you can pursue. In fact, it is probably the rare military cause that is really, truly honorable and good and necessary. And simply going to battle for the sake of one's personal honor seems seldom to be a wise and even more seldom to be a morally sound idea. I would say in general, I'm probably of the make love not war persuasion, in which case this is a kind of an anti-use. This is actually a terrible idea. But again, I don't think that's the poem's virtue. The poem's virtue is to be sweet, to be memorable, and to ring true, not because its message is true, but because the speech in the mouth of the speaker feels true then, both in the moment of the poem, and it feels true to the heart of the speaker. It feels convincing as something he might say to his lover to mollify her as he's going to leave her. It is so exquisitely well put that, the line that's just the real treasure of the poem, a sword, a horse, a shield, this compression into three grammatically parallel objects, these three images that sit, just off the center of the poem and hold in their arrangement the whole force of this case, this argument that he's making. With a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Asyndeton is the word for dropping the and from that kind of list. And I think it is exactly right here. Almost as if he's taking up each of these objects in turn. Strapping on his sword, mounting the horse, and being handed his heavy shield by a page or a squire, and having to address each of them in turn, rather than just stringing them all casually along in a list. He's having to deal with the reality of each, a sword, a horse, a shield. It is so good, this poem. But I don't think it is especially useful. What I do think it does is it illustrates a conflict between not just two desires, two, wishes. The lover's, Lucasta's presumed wish that he stay home, and the speaker's wish to go to war, but two sort of greater missions, two greater sources of meaning and value that we might imagine that for Lucasta, and presumably for the speaker, at least up to this moment, or within a slightly earlier context, the great source of meaning in life was love. It is the love that I have for you that gives my life meaning, that keeps, that makes me the man I am. I am inspired. I am driven. I wear your favor, tucked in my armor. I mount your balcony beneath your window. I swear, by your name, you are the center of my solar system. But now he has a different center, and he tries to reconcile these two with a pretty direct and aggressive paradox. He says, yes, it is a kind of faithlessness I am showing to you. It is a kind of cheating on you that I am doing. But I demand that you will, I assert that you shall adore it, because without it, I couldn't love you the way I do. It seemed that love for Lucasta gave his life meaning. It may be, we don't know, we don't ever actually get to hear from Lucasta. It may be that the love she and the speaker share gave her life meaning. But now there's this conflicting source of meaning, of importance, of justification that he could not stand to let go unpursued, unanswered, which is the need for honor. Honor is one of these tricky values that once it gets called into question, it is very hard to make a case for whether it is in fact in question, right? The mere calling of it into question seems to put it at risk. And so any challenge to honor, even a theoretical one, it's almost like Rule 34. The Rule 34 is the jokey internet folk rule that states that if you can imagine a kind of pornography, that pornography exists, right? Just whatever you want to imagine, the craziest kind of porn you can think of, probably somebody is already into that, and you can already find it online if you want to. Honor is kind of like that. Like if you propose that somebody's honor might be at risk, if you even imagine that your honor might be at risk, suddenly it is at risk, and that challenge must be answered. So whether or not this is a good war, whether or not it is a necessary war, whether or not he has any business fighting it, the possibility has arisen, and therefore the challenge must be answered. And we can argue about whether love or honor is a better commanding purpose, is a better source of meaning. But the fact is that in this case, they are in conflict. He does his best to reconcile them, but he brings them both up as ostensible sources of meaning, as ostensible justifications for a man's life, without which nothing else really can stand. And that's what this episode is really about, is the question of this justification. All right, here one more time is To Lucasta, Going to the Wars by Richard Lovelace. This was written in the early mid-17th century. He was born the year after Shakespeare died, is that right? Huh, okay. To Lucasta, Going to the Wars by Richard Lovelace. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more. So that particular framing of the question, justification, what justifies a man's life? What, is my life justified? How can I find justification for my life? That particular construction is one I take from Borges, who uses it again and again including in his little parable of the leopard, taken from Inferno, Canto 1, line 32. Is that right? Is that the title he gives it? I think that's right. In which he talks about the leopard that appears in the Divine Comedy as an image. And he ends with a vision of Dante, the poet, at the end of his life. And he says that Dante was dying in Ravenna as unjustified as any man, which is an instructive use of the word because it's ambiguous. Dante Alighieri, of course, is one of the most famous and celebrated poets of all time. He is widely recognized as one of the very greats. I mean, he placed himself in a circle of the maximally accomplished poets of antiquity. Horace, Virgil, who did he put in that circle? Horace, Virgil, Lucan, I know, was a kind of a surprising inclusion. Ovid, was it Horace? Homer, yeah, of course, Homer, good Lord, what's wrong with me? Yeah, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, and Homer, and implicitly Virgil, who was on the trip with Dante. They include him in their ranks, and for the most part, he is included in those ranks by modernity as well. He's seen as sort of one of the great beacons of the Italian Renaissance, maybe even by some measures the starting gun. But in Borges' parable, he's unjustified as any man. Meaning, I guess, either his life is actually unjustified, even Dante, having written the Divine Comedy by that point, even for him, his life was unjustified. Or, of course, he simply felt unjustified. This is a little bit like the way we use the word guilt ambiguously. He was guilty could mean either he actually was culpable for some crime, or he was guilty as in he felt guilt. Which, if you're raised Catholic like me, you know that these are two very different categories. That in fact, real guilt is by no means a prerequisite for the feeling of guilt. But I think the ambiguity in Borges' parable is apt, right? Because justification is such a tricky question, and it is one that one is always asking of oneself in some capacity. So the books that I have been reading, there are a couple books that have already come up on this podcast, one being Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I have a whole episode all about why that is not only not one of the greatest books of all time, as it is frequently praised, and a source of meaning that every uncertain young person or middle-aged person going through an existential crisis should go read. Not only is it not that, it is actually actively a very bad book that probably nobody should read. I already did a whole episode on that. I will link to that in the show notes. You're welcome to go listen. But that book is, of course, in part about this question. Man's Search for Meaning is really, in the context of that book, an individual man's search for individual meaning. With some heavy nudges toward weirdly a Christian worldview, given that Frankl was Jewish. But that does seem to be the most Christian book written by somebody who is definitely Jewish and not Christian himself, perhaps of all time. Another book that is relevant, though maybe not less pressingly so, is The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti, which has come up a couple times on this show as well. The thesis of that book, of course, being that life, conscious life, sentient life, is a terrible mistake. And the best thing of all for man would be, as in keeping with Theognis wisdom, would be never to be born. And in fact, we would do well simply to stop procreating, as we seem already to be doing at the moment. Like, we seem to be not procreating. And so in an odd way, Ligotti seems to be getting his wish. So those books are relevant. The second book in particular, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, cites two other texts again and again and again. One is Peter Zapf's The Last Messiah, an essay that came out in 1933 by a Norwegian philosopher, I believe. We've talked about that on the podcast before. And another much longer text, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. That book has also come up on the show before, but it was mostly Elijah who talked about it because though he and I started it at the same time, he finished it months before I did. I finished it some time ago now, but it's taken me a while to chew it over. Elijah is much quicker to read and much quicker to process than I am. He talked with Alice a little bit about it on the show. I have been thinking about this book for a while. The other three books that are relevant, and that I think the part of the reason that it's taken me a while to do this episode is that I think I will have to basically do episodes about all of these books, but probably just not all at the same time. The other three books that are relevant are Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein's book, The Mattering Instinct, which is a new book. And while I was reading The Denial of Death, I kept hearing interviews with her about this new book of hers, which is very much an heir to Becker's book. And in fact, to some extent, there's more to it than this, but it is a little bit of The Denial of Death for Dummies book, though she would and does absolutely deny that. The other two books are The Optimists by Brian Platzer and The Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham. The Optimist is a novel. The Razor's Edge is another novel and was one of the major inspirations for Brian's novel. In fact, so much so that my neighbor Kathleen, who was obsessed with Brian's book and still talking about it at the morning bus stop, she, because of Brian's book, then read The Razor's Edge and has been mulling that over. And it is in no small part because both of these books address in such a pointed and provocative fashion the question of what justifies a man's life. Even if in The Optimists, one of the central characters, the ostensible central character, is a girl, a little girl who then grows up to be a woman. Though again, contra Paul Muldoon's wife, she is not actually the main character of the book. But today I want to talk about The Denial of Death. This is a book. It was published in 1973. It won the 1974 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. It's by Ernest Becker. He was a clinical psychologist. Oh, you know what? I thought he was a psychologist. Let's see. He worked across disciplines a lot. He speaks so much. He had a doctorate in cultural anthropology. Okay, all right. But he speaks so much about Freud and Freudianism in his book that I assumed he was a psychologist because, for those who are not familiar, contemporary psychiatrists do not read Freud. But contemporary psychologists do read Freud, and even more than Freud, they read Freudians. So that made me think he was a psychologist. He was actually an anthropologist, though, of course, with a great deal of overlap. But he published Denial of Death in 1973. He won the Pulitzer in 1974, a couple months after he had died, because just before it was published, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. So he was publishing The Denial of Death as he was dying and knew he was dying. This book won the Pulitzer, and it has been very widely praised, and I think rightly so. But as I read it, I started to get the idea that there was a little bit of an Infinite Jest situation going on here. That is, Infinite Jest is an 1,100-page book by David Foster Wallace that was a massive, massive cultural phenomenon in 1996 and 7, and from then on until it started to become a punchline. But it became this without... If you read Infinite Jest, it is both brilliant and a total fucking mess. It has some really amazing stuff in it. It has, to the degree to which it has structure, it is a real self-indulgent shambles of a structure. It is filled with endnotes, which is actually terrible. Frequently they're referred to as footnotes. If they were actually footnotes, they would be 1,000 times easier to deal with because they would be at the bottom of the page on which they appeared. right? But endnotes are all at the end of the book, which means, as again, my neighbor Kathleen pointed out, you need 2 bookmarks to read this book. It is very impressive, but it is a massive slog to read. And it is extremely unsatisfying as a whole motion. But it was so significant that I think what was inevitably the case was that a very large number of people were talking about it and even praising it or arguing about it without, crucially, having read it. And I am now convinced that that is also true of The Denial of Death. Because The Denial of Death, while containing some real brilliance, and I think definitely being more of a unified whole than Infinite Jest, and being a whole lot shorter, for that it's only 400 pages, 300 something pages. No, it's like 300 pages. Yeah, it's not nearly as long. But it's still quite a slog for much of it. And it was done a real disservice by its editors. Maybe because Becker was dying, maybe because he was rushing to get it out, maybe because they felt bad, but it was very under-edited. And it contains these like crazy long digressions all about sort of technical Freudian questions in a way that really are beside the point of the thesis of the book. He has a whole long passage on the meaning of anality. Anality, as in being obsessed with your anus in a Freudian sense. This stuff gets so old so quickly, and it is such a drag to read so much of this book, that I am convinced that the combination of a very provocative premise, a kind of a poignant story of the author's own life and death. I had not realized that, Viktor Frankl was in a Nazi concentration camp. Becker, I had not realized, apparently helped to liberate one. So there's this is definitely as with Man's Search for Meaning, a far, far worse book than this one. The extremities of human experience inform this book. And so it is so provocative. It is so touching in the context of the author's own life. And it is so obnoxious actually to read that I am convinced that a very large number of the people who have had things to say about this book never read it or didn't read all of it. I was talking to my therapist when I was reading it, and I had gotten like 80 pages in, and I was talking about like, oh man, this is really getting painful. And he said, well, you made it a lot farther than I did. Which was wonderfully frank of him. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people who just aren't as honest as my therapist about the limits of their willingness to read boring shit. So a lot of this book is very boring. A lot of it is very poorly structured. A lot of it is extremely self-indulgent, though not in a David Foster Wallace way, but rather in a very Freudian way. It's very concerned with Freudism. It's also obsessed with Otto Rank, an Austrian psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. The problem is that when you get like Freudianism threw such a wrench into the mental health fields that it becomes very hard to translate a particular stripe of the discipline from early in the 20th century into early in the 21st century. But Otto Rank, major thinker in questions of mental health in the early 20th century, a student of Freud, huge source of obsession for Ernest Becker. Like listening to Ernest Becker go on and on and on about Otto Rank, which he does throughout the entire fucking book, is very much like listening to Paul Giamatti defend Pinot Noir in Sideways. Like it is just like, not only does it go on too long, although in retrospect, that little speech that Giamatti gives is quite short because Alexander Payne is actually a pretty good screenwriter. But like what's so painful about that speech, of course, is that he is obviously talking about himself. That it is obviously not about Pinot Noir. It is about him. And the same is very much true for Becker when he talks about Otto Rank. It's also true when he goes on and on and on about all these extremely obscure technical questions of Freudian terminology, most of which is, as science, bunk. That said, the central premise of this book is truly radical I was trying to think of a way to frame it, but it is hard to convey how shocking the premise of this book is. And it is much easier simply to dismiss it out of hand, as certain critics do, including Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, including somebody like Thomas Nagel in The Absurd. He dismisses Camus. I don't know if he spoke about this book, but you can imagine that if he did, he probably would have had something very similar to say. I think most people who dismiss this book, my brother who dismissed it, admittedly without reading it, by saying like, that sounds very stupid and boring and immature and self-absorbed. The dismissal tends to be, oh, grow up. Oh, get over it. No real mature grown-up is so worried about this stuff. I think that is a massive error. But that's because, again, the premise is so radical. So there is a little children's book my wife loves from when she was a kid called Jenny the Halloween Spy. I've mentioned it before on the show. It is about a woman who gets a little bit of fairy potion dripped in one of her eyes, and it allows her to see that behind the whole normal world that we see around us every day, there is actually a fairy world. And it is inhabited not just by cute little elves and wights, but also by, it's W-I-G-H-T, not W-H-I-T. I do kind of like the idea that you could put a drop in your eye and it would allow you to see all the cute little secret white people bouncing around. That's not that book, different book. But it also allows you to see the world of the demons. And of course, one of the closing images of the book is a terrifying, triumphant Satan rising up through the flames surrounded by skulls. So Jenny the Halloween Spy is a book in which most people never see the real world, right? Similar to the premise of The Matrix, in which the world of the protagonist, Neo, is one in which people do not recognize the real world that is hiding behind the surface, the world of artificial intelligence and these agent computer programs and humanity enslaved for its, for its battery power. I was thinking about these as possible analogies for the denial of death, but even they're not quite right, because Becker is not saying that everybody is failing to see what's really there, right? Like a classic Marxist argument would be, you're looking around you, and you think you understand the world, but there's really another layer to reality behind the one that you see. You have false consciousness. And then if you were actually to ask questions about who's motivated by which class advantage in the endless class struggle that is history, you would start to see that the things you perceive about your life, your job, your religion, your family, your sense of morality, that all of these are actually influenced by other economic motives behind the scenes, right? That's a classic Marxist argument. That is more in line with The Matrix. That's more in line with Jenny the Halloween Spy. That's not even quite what Ernest Becker is saying. Here's how crazy Ernest Becker's premise is. It is like if we all lived in the land of the emperor's new clothes. That is, all of us agreed publicly that the emperor was wearing fabulous new clothes. We all said that to each other, and we recognized that as a consensus reality, even though privately, secretly, each one of us experienced no such clothes, that saw that the emperor was naked. Each of us secretly, privately has that experience, seeing the nakedness of the emperor, that there really are no new clothes. But then in public, and in so much so that in all of our conversations, we take it as an absolute given that of course, the emperor has new clothes. And occasionally when a little kid says, hey, the emperor's naked, we say, shush, 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 shush. Or we laugh, we say, oh, well, you know kids, they don't understand the emperor's new clothes. They think the emperor is naked because they're foolish children. The premise of Becker's book is not, hey, the emperor is actually naked. The premise of Becker's book is, hey, you know how you are all saying the emperor has new clothes, but then really secretly you know that he doesn't have new clothes? The truth is that he does have new clothes, and you're in denial by thinking that he's naked privately. The other analogy that comes to mind here is Nietzsche's parable of the madman, which is, I believe, the first place in print he says God is dead. It's in the Gay Science, and this has come up on the show before. But again, the thing that is so wildly, wildly misunderstood about this statement, people read Nietzsche as making some sort of battle cry by saying, God is dead, let's do away with God, in like a Christopher Hitchens sense. That is almost the opposite of what he's doing. In his parable, a ragged madman approaches a bunch of civilized, bourgeois, educated folk all standing politely together, having a civilized conversation, and the madman is howling and screaming incoherently, and they say, what is the matter? And he says, oh my God, God is dead. We have killed God. This is terrible. This is an emergency. This is a disaster. And their response is not, God is not dead. No. Their response is, of course God is dead. Of course. Obviously. Are you just now realizing this? You immature little child? You fool? We have all known that God is dead for a long time. And the madman's response is so telling. His response is not, oh, I guess I'm just privately going through this crisis that all of you have all maturely already metabolized, and I need to catch up to you so that I can live in a similarly polite and controlled and coherent, civilized manner. No. His response is, I see I have come too soon. Meaning, you think you know God is dead. You haven't actually realized it yet, because if you had, you would be screaming like me. That's the premise of Becker's book. Obviously, the people buying this book, reading this book, think they know what death is. Think they know that they are mortal. The thesis of his book is, no, you don't. You only believe you know what death is. But secretly, privately, deep in your own heart, you see the emperor and you think he's naked. Well, he's not. Death is real. And though you have convinced yourself that the adult, mature thing to do is to behave as if this is all unremarkable, that the only person who would ever be upset by this would be a child or a madman, the truth is that you yourself have never really reckoned with it. Death is real. You will die. And not only that, but part of you, deep down, suspects this. And all of that work you do, all of that fretting you do, all of the busyness of your life is, in fact, an elaborate effort to keep the illusion in place, to stave off that secret, creeping suspicion that death might be real for you. Because as Heidegger pointed out, there are two kinds of death. There's anybody else's death, and then there's my death. And the second one is the one that really counts. All right, I think I may have to do this episode Alice style, where I continually break off and have little separately recorded segments as I go, because we're having had a major child crisis a moment ago. So Here we are back again. It occurs to me, by the way, that I should probably clarify when I was saying that I think a lot of people talked about the denial of death but never read it. I was really talking about, as with Infinite Jest, people at the time. Like, I don't think that many people bother pretending to read it now. I think probably, as with a lot of books like this, plenty of people buy the book and never read it. But I was not subtweeting Elijah, because I think Elijah did actually read it. I just think he is legitimately. I mean, it's actually not. It is not actually a compliment to say that Elijah is a faster reader than I am. That's true of pretty much everybody. But I have like a little 20-minute chunk now, 15-minute chunk now, before I have to run and do another child-related task. So I thought I would try to get a little further into this book. The one way of framing the thesis. I mean, again, like, I think the book is sort of divided into like Becker's elaboration of his thesis. He does, as Kant does with the categorical imperative, he sort of like frames it several different ways to try to get what is a relatively difficult idea through. Again, a simple idea, but such a weirdly counterintuitive one that I think it is hard for people to digest what he's actually saying. Like, if this would be like if in the world of The Emperor's New Clothes, somebody published a book called The Denial of the Emperor's New Clothes. like which would be a weird thing to read. Like, and there would probably be some people who read that as saying, like, that the Emperor's New Clothes are not real, or that the Emperor's New Clothes, or like that it is silly that children don't think the Emperor's New Clothes, because children are the ones who think he's naked, and so we're talking about what children do, but not what I'm doing, because I, of course, am an adult, and I know that the Emperor's clothes are real. So one way he puts this is he says, we can say that the essence of normality is the refusal of reality. Another way he puts it is to grow up at all. And this is kind of in responding to those suggestions that, like, it's only children who deny death. Any mature adult, what are you freaking out about? What's the big deal? In response to that kind of objection, Becker says, to grow up at all is to conceal the mass of internal scar tissue that throbs in our dreams. He says, civilized society is a hopeful belief and protest that science, money, and goods make man count for more than any other animal. There is an oft paraphrased, kind of like often joked about claim that Camille Paglia has made that basically it's a combination of like a kind of a misogynistic suggestion that like women don't care about doing anything except nursing babies, and it's also it's like it almost feels like a version of like a Chris Rock routine. I mean, probably preceded the Chris Rock routine. But the argument is basically like all of civilization is just the efforts of men trying to get laid. That if it were not for men trying to get laid, we would all just be living in boxes or in, hovels. And that is not Becker's claim. But his claim is sort of that all of civilization is just the result of human beings desperately trying to convince each one himself. Right, because we have a relatively easy time accepting the fact that other people will die. But each one of us himself is so desperate to avoid really, really digesting the fact of his own death that we will go to the trouble of establishing a millennia-long civilization in order to avoid it. He says, we disguise our struggle by piling up figures in a bank book to privately reflect our sense of heroic worth, or by having only a little better home in the neighborhood, a bigger car, brighter children. But underneath, here's that throbs again, but underneath throbs the ache of cosmic specialness, no matter how we mask it in concerns of smaller scope. We say we are worried about something relatively unimportant, but what we are actually doing is we are fighting against that dawning recognition that I will die. I, me, not non-transferable. As Heidegger says, death is not transferable. No man can die another man's death. Even if you are executed in place of someone else, to cite my favorite Onion headline of all time again, existentialist firefighter delays 4 deaths. No one can die someone else's death. Each one of us still has to face that inevitability. I have a related sort of like sub-theory of this book. And it is partly an attempt to explain why some people seem very lightly to be able to dismiss it or to dismiss claims like this. But maybe I'll talk about Becker's own argument a little more before getting there. He has a set of vocabulary that he uses to talk about this stuff, some of which I think is relatively helpful. Some of which is, I think, slightly confusing or kind of bogged down in Freudianism and post-Freudianism. In addition to spending way too much of the book talking about the meaning of anality, he also uses the terms heroic or heroism and the term transference. So transference is a Freudian term. I think probably the most common use of it is in discussing the very unremarkable, very very common phenomenon of a psychoanalytic patient developing romantic or erotic feelings for the psychoanalyst. So basically, you transfer your feelings to the nearest available eligible object, which sometimes is the psychoanalyst, or the teacher, or the priest, or whoever. You take your feelings that ought to be going somewhere else, and you transfer them to an inappropriate but convenient object. He uses transference to again. I think he probably would have been better off not using psychoanalytic jargon, but he's using it mostly to talk about the way in which we take our concern for our own mortality. And again, this always really happens at the individual level, even if there's a collective effect. My sense of my own mortality, I transfer that to something else. Whether this is my work as an artist, which he talks about at length. The artist sort of hopes to achieve immortality through his work. Elijah talked about the Immortality Project, which is, I think, one of Becker's more useful constructions. He talks about each of us has an immortality project. He also talks about the causa sui project, which means sort of for its own sake, the thing you're doing for its own sake, the thing that is not an ulterior motive. But of course, he would say the actual ultimate ulterior motive is your own immortality. But also, I think he talks about transference as being like we can transfer. I might transfer my sense of my own desire for immortality to another person or another project, to the revolution or to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or this or that leader. He says, I think pretty convincingly he has a pretty good account of cult leaders and people who go crazy over a celebrity or a political leader. He says, "Why are groups so blind and stupid? Men have always asked. Because they demand illusions," answered Freud. "They constantly give what is unreal precedence over what is real. And we know why. The real world is simply too terrible to admit. It tells man that he is a small, trembling animal who will decay and die. Illusion changes all this, makes man seem important, vital to the universe, immortal in some way." Plenty of people have talked about the importance of the big lie Rebecca Newberger-Goldstein goes on at length about it. Lots of people have talked about this. That when you are in a cult, or when you're in a religious group, or when you're in a political extremist group, or whatever sort of socio-existential endeavor, there's actually utility to believing something ridiculous. That in fact, the more you are willing to commit to the most ridiculous claims of your project, the more dedicated you are to it. And I would say, I would go beyond that. That like when you have a deep faith in a cult leader, when you have deeply attached yourself, your meaning, to some crazy project, to L. Ron Hubbard, to whatever, to Charles Manson. I was going to say Marilyn Manson. different episode. To Keith Raniere, right? Like partly the depth of your commitment demonstrates the depth of your belief demonstrates the depth of your commitment to the cause. But I would say beyond that, when you believe some charismaless schmuck like Keith Raniere is not only the smartest man on earth, but the key to your own and others' salvation, the fact that other people think that's ridiculous makes it more appealing. Because he is carrying now the burden of your immortality, of your cosmic specialness. And of course, we all know, just as we look very differently on other people's lives than on our own, they look differently on our lives and our deaths. Right? The death of somebody else could be very, very sad. But my death is a cause for panic. And I know at some level other people think that's ridiculous because I'm not actually special. There isn't actually a reason my death is more important than anyone else's, except that I experience my life in the first person. Elijah showed me recently a line from Jung where he tells the same patient anecdote. Again, when it's published, it's not an anecdote. The same patient story he tells with Vienna substituted in for Paris. And the story is Freud's, and of course, like what this said to me was just that the two guys spent a lot of time together, talked a lot about patients, shared some of these kind of stories and anecdotes, and they got recycled and reworked along the way. But Freud's version is, a husband says of his marriage, he and his wife, he says, well, if one of us should die, I would move to Paris. Right? And he doesn't hear what he's saying, which is that, I never actually imagine my own death. I imagine her death. And there's a ridiculousness in that. There's something silly about that. And we all realize we're vulnerable to that charge of silliness, that charge of ridicule. And so, when you believe in the alien spaceships and the seeding of the thetans in our souls, or in Keith Raniere's, the importance of his sex cult branding, when you believe in, the Manson's vision of the race war and whatever other nonsense he was cooking up, the ridiculousness of that belief, of that commitment, corresponds at some level to what you know is the ridiculousness of your commitment to your own life at a whole different scale than anyone else's. Becker says of groups, he says, have we been astonished by fantastic displays of grief on the part of whole peoples when one of their leaders dies? The uncontrolled emotional outpouring, the dazed masses standing huddled in the city squares sometimes for days on end, grown people groveling hysterically and tearing at themselves, being trampled in the surge toward the coffin or funeral pyre. How to make sense out of such a massive neurotic vaudeville of despair? In one way only. It shows a profound state of shock at losing one's bulwark against death. I feel the same way when a celebrity dies. Again, there are celebrities whose deaths have taken me by surprise. Mark Linkous' was a surprise. Elliot Smith's was a surprise. Amy Winehouse's, in all three cases, surprise but not surprise. Terrible kind of inevitability there. Both Linkous and Smith killed themselves. Some controversy about Smith's. Amy Winehouse, was pursuing death in her own way her whole adult life. I've been taken by surprise, but I think I haven't been shaken the ways people often feel shaken by celebrity deaths, even celebrity deaths that are not so untimely. Given the amount of drugs that David Bowie took, that he lived as long as he did, is, it was like, all right, you had a good run there. A great run in many respects. But people are really thrown off by these deaths in a way that I always find a little curious. But I think it's very much the same thing Becker's talking about here. He goes on, he says, the people apprehend at some dumb level of their personality. And by dumb, I think Becker is often condescending. I think this condescension applies to all of us. We are all, all of us operate with this sort of illusion. The people apprehend at some dumb level of their personality, our locus of power to control life and death can himself die. Therefore, our own immortality is in doubt. All the tears and the tearing is, after all, for oneself, not for the passing of a great soul, but for one's own passing. Immediately men begin to rename city streets, squares, airports with the name of the dead man. It is as though to declare that he will be immortalized physically in the society in spite of his own physical death. All right, this one's definitely going to need to end up being a two-parter, but maybe I'll just try to get a little more done in this first section. So I mentioned that Becker's use of transference was maybe not ideal. I do think that it's like he ends up using like a very technical term for what I think could be a relatively simple idea. There's so much of what is bad in this book and what is bad in Freudian writing in general, and even in Freud. Freud is a genius, but when he is at his worst, it is when he is trying to prove scientifically the technical validity of some particular psychoanalytic claim. And I just think that's it's a fool's errand, and it doesn't make for good or persuasive writing for the most part. But I think if you're able to get through the technical terminology Becker uses, at least in much of this book, then there's some real convincing. There's a convincing account of a lot of human experience in it, that when we attach ourselves to powerful figures or to sports teams or to countries or to causes or even to projects of any kind, part of what we are doing is we are identifying ourselves with them. We are taking the anxiety that we feel about our own existence, and we're placing it elsewhere. We are transferring it. I think that's the simplest, clearest understanding of the term. But the psychoanalytic particulars of it, I think, are less helpful. The other term he uses that I think is is tricky, but does point to a worthwhile concept, is heroism or the heroic. Part of what is frustrating is that he doesn't even really bother to explain why he's using this term. He just sort of takes it as a given that every person wants to be a hero, or everyone wants to see himself in heroic terms. And it's not that can't be true, it's just that it doesn't seem obviously true in that language, and he just sort of takes it as a given. So there are a lot of different ways to understand hero or heroism. The way I think it is sort of best understood, because what he means is not hero in like the classical sense. He doesn't mean somebody who occasionally does something godlike, though that's not an unrelated term, but that's sort of the closest to a consistent definition of hero as one might find in like great epic poetry. So that heroes are frequently doing unheroic things, but every once in a while they do something godlike, and that's what makes them really heroes. Apart from maybe if you want to define them as demigods, but that's not as consistent across the board. What Becker seems to mean by heroism is something closer to apotheosis. So like becoming a god. And the prime example of this is Heracles, who was born the son of a god, but if one of your parents is a god, with a very few exceptions, one of them being Dionysus for because he was born out of Zeus's body as well. For the most part, though, if only one of your parents is a god, you are still mortal, but you may have amazing powers and properties, and you'll live longer and stay young longer, and be more talented and so on. Be luckier, be more beloved of the gods. But Heracles, despite being the son of Zeus, is mortal, and he lives a very mortal, very flawed life, does some terrible, terrible things, both, weak things and sort of horrifying crimes. He murders his own family in a fit of rage, among other things. But he also performs some great heroic feats, and at the end of his life, he is honored by the gods by being elevated to Olympus. He becomes a god at the end of his life. That is what an apotheosis is. And I think that's closer to what Becker means. In a way, though, I think maybe even the more helpful framing of it, for me at least, was to think of heroism as something more like the hero's journey. The hero in that sense. The hero is the central character. I have, as I've mentioned to my students before, I'm very annoyed by the current popularity of the term main character syndrome as an insult for others. Oh, that's a real case of main character syndrome. The reason this annoys me is that all of us have main character syndrome. Like, every single human being has main character syndrome. I just think, like, if you don't, it is maybe because you suffered a brain injury or you're a Buddhist monk, but I think, like, pretty much everybody has main character syndrome. And we have to make an effort, specifically and maybe generally, maybe habitually, to reframe ourselves, to reframe the world such that I am not the center of it. I just think, like, having a first-person perspective creates the natural tendency to place yourself at the center of things. And it takes reminding, it takes habit forming to remember that you're not at the center. But that tendency, I think, is extremely natural and is native to the first person as a phenomenon. This is my annoyance then further with the hero's journey, as I've mentioned, is that it is not that the hero's journey doesn't ring true, and not that it's not a fairly universal story, but what annoys me about it is that it seems only to reaffirm our sort of basest, most unexamined, like, childhood presumptions, right? The hero's journey is the story of thinking that you are, or being told by the world that you are just the son of a farmer. You're just a peasant. You're just the child who gets locked in the cupboard under the stairs. You're just the son of some dumb carpenter. You're just some schmo. You're nobody. But then, actually, secretly, it turns out that your strange suspicion that you were somehow special. You were not just a dirt farmer on Tatooine. You were not just the worm-like, unwanted nephew of Sir Kay. You're actually the son of the king, the son of a god. That little suspicion of yours, it turns out, according to the hero's journey, that's correct. That, in fact, your true place is not out in the provinces. Your true place is not out far away from anything that matters. Your true place is at the center of things. That's what I find so annoying about the hero's journey, is that I think that sneaking suspicion is universal. And the hero's journey, as a story, seems only to affirm it. So I in that way, I just find it to be almost like it's not that I want more stories to be moral, but I do think that at least part of what is the kind of the deep pleasure of a story is having it ring true, having it call out to us as recognizable in a deep way. And this feels to me recognizable in a cheap and shallow and self-serving way. But I think that version of heroism is maybe is the most useful version, the most useful interpretation of Becker's meaning, even if I think he is sort of more specifically concerned with death and immortality. I want to return to this question of like whether death and immortality are really the question at the heart of this whole examination, because I do think there is a conversation to be had about that, but I may hold off on that because I wanted to talk maybe a little bit about embarrassingness, and I have another story for you. So when I was in my second round of grad school, I went to 2 rounds of grad school. One was prestigious, but like not all that educational, and one was almost anti-prestigious, like almost in the creative writing world. I got an MFA at Catholic University, and in the creative writing world, like unless you are at University of St. Thomas or you live in DC, where the Catholic University drama department has a good reputation, rightly so. For the most part, like if you're out in the creative writing world, like having gone to a Catholic college tends not to raise your stock with the average poetry publisher or editor. So that my second MFA was anti-prestigious, but was extremely educational. It was very rigorous. I learned an enormous amount at Catholic. Thanks mostly to John Klein, who used to run the playwriting program there and is now retired. But one of the requirements for the MFA, because it was a drama degree, it was, MFA in playwriting was a drama degree. One of the requirements was that we do some additional work in other aspects of drama. And that included a semester where we had to work either in the scene shop or the costume shop. And I chose the costume shop for 2 reasons, one of which was that I was commuting every day from Baltimore and working in the morning teaching high school. And so I had to wear dress clothes every day, and I didn't want to bring a change of clothes in a bag packed and schlep it to DC and back every day in order to work in the scene shop. So I figured I could just tuck my tie into my shirt and wear my normal teaching clothes when I was doing costume work. That was one reason. The other reason was that I was writing, most of what I was writing in those days. I was writing poetry. That was actually, I was at Catholic when my first book came out, but most of what I was writing in those days was dialogue, was play scripts. And I really wanted to hear how women talk when men are not around. And the costume shop was all women. Except for me. Now, obviously, I was still there, and so I couldn't really hear how women talk when men are around. But I figured I would be kind of like Jane Goodall, and like eventually the Silverbacks would get used to me, and they would sort of, kind of forget that I was there. And if I just stayed quiet and did my sewing, which is I mostly did, I could begin to get at least a hint of how women might talk when men are not around. So I did, and I learned some things. One of the stranger conversations I overheard was a conversation. I think there's like an old meme trope about how men in fantasy novel, male writers in fantasy novels and in sci-fi novels are always writing about women by describing their breasts, and that's a fair criticism. Robert Heinlein comes to mind. But, like one of the jokes is that in fantasy or sci-fi or in male written fiction, women not only have breasts that are notable and worth describing at length, but are always thinking about and talking about their own breasts. And the implication of this joke, this trope, is that actually it's men who are obsessed with women's breasts, and so they are projecting onto their female characters a similar obsession with breasts. That said, maybe that is an argument for why they were not actually talking the way they would if I was not around. Maybe this is for my benefit. I don't think it was, but I overheard a conversation all about breasts. It was not a sexy conversation. It was mostly a conversation about ways in which breasts can be uncomfortable. Wearing bras and being sweaty and having heavy breasts, or having breasts that are too small, or having breasts that get achy at different times. And they were talking about all of this, and I really tried to hunker down and be as not present as physically possible in the room while I was hearing this. But then they were talking about bras and breasts getting heavy and sagging over time. And they were talking about getting older, and there was mostly young women in the room, but some older women. The woman who ran the shop was in her 60s, and they were all sort of talking about how women deal with having breasts over the course of a lifetime. And they turned to one of the graduate students who was there, who had largish breasts, and they said something to her about how she thought about her own breasts and wearing a bra and getting older and how breasts change over time. And this is the thing that made the conversation memorable. It was not all the breast stuff. It was this woman's response when they asked her about this. She looked sheepish and she smiled, and the expression she gave was not one of somebody admitting something embarrassing. It was that of somebody who was embarrassed for the people who were asking the question and was trying not to embarrass them further by drawing undue attention to the ridiculousness of their question. What she said was, "Oh, well, I don't really plan to sag." And the women in the room sort of, this piqued their interest. It definitely piqued mine. And they said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I don't really plan to age. Obviously, I will get older, but I don't plan to let my breasts sag or my skin droop or get wrinkled or lose muscle tone. I don't plan to allow myself to go gray or to become less vital and luscious and moist over time. I plan to stay the way I am now." She was about 30 at the time. And the response to this was mostly a sort of a dumbstruck muttering and silence, but there was a real desire to know what the hell she was talking about. And she went on to explain that she had a very practical regime that she kept. It had to do with nutrition, had to do with fitness, and she was aware of all the risks, all the threat of aging, and she was taking precautions to see that she would never age. And I've thought about this since then because it was so surprising. And I think in retrospect, what was most surprising about this admission is not that it was ridiculous, right? Because of course we all age, and some people age more dramatically than others. Some people age, more slowly than others. Some people, are blessed with either genes or they do take a great deal of care, and that care can do something to slow down aging or to mitigate aging. But of course, none of us can avoid aging entirely, which really was her goal, and not just her goal, her expectation, because she had worked out her plan. What is really surprising about her admission is not that it's ridiculous that she thought this. What was really surprising is that she knew that she thought this, that she was so clear-headed about what she believed. And she was not just willing, but able to articulate it aloud to herself and to others. Because I think this grad student who never planned to age was not actually very unusual. I think there aren't that many people who would have articulated that particular plan. But I think what she was really capturing in that assessment of herself was a kind of denial that almost all of us maintains. We almost all carry on a kind of denial. Now, usually we know better than to say it aloud. We know better even than to say it to ourselves. But at some level, we expect things to be different for us. As Becker says, one of the main reasons that it is so easy to march men off to war is that deep down each of them feels sorry for the man next to him who will die. Right? I think that's very, very true. I think most of us, at some level, don't really think that the terrible inevitabilities apply to us. And this graduate student knew that about herself and knew it about herself consciously and was able to say it and was brave enough to say it aloud to others. And she was not embarrassed. She was embarrassed for us because it was embarrassing that we were going to age when she had taken precautions against it. But again, that's not because she was a freak. The freakishness was just in her clarity about that delusion. And I do think that being sort of ostentatiously embracing these inevitabilities, ostentatiously mocking and rejecting those who, saying like, oh, I'm sure I will age terribly, and I don't have any angst about all of the terrible things that are going to happen, and cancer, and balding, and sagging, and various ectomies that I have ahead of me, and digestive ailments, and senility, and I think people who make a show of ostentatiously embracing all of the things that they should, and I think most of us do, fear, I think that is in its own way a kind of apotropaic, a kind of protection against the evil eye. Becker says, as you fear that life in this dimension being the world we live in, as you fear that life in this dimension may not count, may not have any real meaning, you relieve your anxiety by being especially scornful of the very thing that you wish for most. You relieve your anxiety by being especially scornful of the very thing that you wish for most, while underneath your writing desk you have your fingers crossed. So I think that's exactly right. And I think that anybody who would make fun of that graduate student would probably be on some level performing this other maneuver, right? Rather than consciously exempting yourself from death and aging and humiliation, you make a show of not being bothered by it. Only a child would be bothered by the specter of death. But I think that is another kind of defense. And this has made me think about the ways in which, like, other people's denial is always ridiculous to us, but I think none of us is actually exempt. None of us is really off the hook. A line from Hamlet came to mind. I can't remember why. I was reading something, the phrasing was similar, but he has this line. He's speaking to Ophelia. I think it's Ophelia. It's either Ophelia or Gertrude. But he says, God hath given you one face and you make yourselves another. This is like a very old misogynistic trope that, women love makeup. Women love to paint their faces, and they pretend to be beautiful, but they're just putting on a pretense there, which is sort of, it's like a two-part accusation. One part is you're not actually as hot as you say you are. You're tricking us. You're using Facetune to make yourself look pretty when you're not really pretty. And the other part of the accusation is you care so much about this. You're obsessed with appearance. You're shallow. But I think that's... it's not even that that's false. Like, I think that is true of a lot of women who do, use a lot of makeup. But I think that kind of insecurity, that kind of denial, that patheticness, the embarrassingness of that is real, but it's also universal. Like, the idea that Hamlet doesn't have anything to be embarrassed about, the idea that Hamlet doesn't have any insecurity, would be insane, right? Of course he does. He's so insecure about not seeming to love Ophelia enough that he jumps into the grave after she's killed herself, and he gets into a fist fight with her brother, claiming that he would be willing to be buried under a higher pile of dirt than her brother would be. I think, again, I think this happens all the time. This is what's happening when women make fun of men who care about penis size. Oh yeah, get a penis enlargement surgery. You idiot, you dum, right? Is it ridiculous to be obsessed with the size of your penis? Of course it is. But are people who are not obsessed with the size of their penis off the hook for that kind of ridiculousness? No, we are all ridiculous. It's what happens when atheists make fun of religious people for believing in a sky daddy. Oh, you care about? I've never even really bothered thinking about a sky daddy. I don't care. It wouldn't bother me if there wasn't a sky daddy. Of course, there's not. But you're obsessed with it. It's what when conservatives make fun of progressives for believing in the revolution or socialism. By the way, like, I have to say that the new trend in like Catholics and Christians talking about the ideal Christian society, like a good, just Christian nation, and how that would actually work. I have to say, like, the Christian nation people are starting to have a real true communism has never been tried problem. Like, there's so many examples of Christian nations that had huge problems that then, and all of the discussions are like, oh, but in a true Christian nation, none of these problems would emerge. Like, it really is the true communism has never been tried. Like, there have been communist nations. Things tend to go really badly, but like, you talk to any Marxist and they'll say, oh, well, but that none of those were those were not real communist nations. And again, like, is the insecure attachment to this one particular ideal a little bit embarrassing? Does it reveal something squirmy about the person who holds it? Of course it does. Is any of us exempt? No, not even close. When we make fun of New Age types for believing in finding themselves, when we make fun of business people, like capitalist business people, finance pros for oh, you're going to die with the most toys. You want to make the most money. You're going to win the race. We make fun of artists for mocking, for believing in their shitty art. Oh, great. Oh, you're a spoken word artist. Oh, you're an interpretive dancer. It's what I thought when I read Becker talking about, holy shit, he talks so much in this book about how terrible it is, how unbearable a fact of human life it is, that the anus and the genitals are placed very close to each other. He can't stop talking about how much this upsets him, that the anus and the genitals are right next to each other. And I gotta say, like, this is like, I get it. Yep. But like, is it something that I've thought about yearly? Like, let alone daily, hourly, as he seems to? No, it's not something that bothers me that much. But he can't get over it. And again, that's not because he's fundamentally less mature or less well-adjusted than I am. It's because he's got a different embarrassing insecurity than I have. And this is, I think, what comes to mind when I hear people say, like, oh, but come on, who's really that concerned with death? I mean, like, get over it. When you're a kid, you learn you're going to die. And then after that, it's not that big a deal. I think when I hear people say that about death, I have two thoughts. Like, one thought I have is, really? Really? Have you really digested this? But the other thought I have is that maybe there is a thing that is not death that is at the center of this. That, like, Becker's book is called The Denial of Death, and it is about death as this sort of central, terrible fact of human existence. But I wonder if it's really finally death that's at the center, or if death is maybe just one of the stronger, more unavoidable demonstrations of the terrible fact that's at the center of things. Because I think, the same people who dismiss as childish or immature a fear of death will sometimes experience a fear of existential meaninglessness, or they will fear the loss of status, social status, or they will fear the loss of beauty or health, the loss of money. They will fear failing at their work or losing their identity, losing their community role. I think, like, seldom is the same, and plenty of people do make fun of every one of those fears and every one of those insecurities. But I think very seldom is the same person able to confidently dismiss all of those insecurities. Typically, there is at least one that really does get its hooks into you. This is what I thought about when I was talking to Alice. And she said, like, it had never really bothered her to think about, like, whether the God does or doesn't exist. And that makes perfect sense to me. But again, I think it's partly because, for me, the question of God's existence is bound up in this question of death, is bound up in this question of a fundamental insignificance, a fundamental contingency to human existence. And so, as goes God, so goes this other hope I have to matter at all, to have a life that is anything more than biological refuse. And I think if you were raised without religion, then it's your sense of that hope for your life to matter is not going to be tied up in divinity. It's not going to be tied up in theism the way it will be if you were raised in a religious context. But I think I am very skeptical that there is any person anywhere who is truly free of all of these fears. And so I don't know if death is at the center. I think death is close to the center. But I think the denial that maybe Becker is pointing to with this book is maybe something closer to a denial of triviality, a denial of insignificance, a denial of non-centrality of some sort. And again, I find the premise so shocking, but also so fundamentally convincing once I've heard it, that it is difficult for me to dismiss Becker the way people seem to be interested. People seem to be inclined to dismiss him now. And again, I am very skeptical of the people at the time who praised this book had actually all read it. Here are two more quotations that I think are other kind of ways of reframing his central thesis that I think are illuminating. He says, neurosis is the contriving of pride. Neurosis is a neurotic is sort of the classic patient for psychoanalysis. If you're a neurotic, you're somebody who's having trouble living his life, and the cure for that, according to the psychoanalytic premise, is to get you to recognize about your life something that you have failed to recognize to this point. And so you are living in a kind of a conflict with your own existence because you're not in good faith with yourself. Becker, to his credit, reads this problem very differently. He says, neurosis is the contriving of private obsessional ritual to replace the socially agreed one now lost by the demise of traditional society. This is not so different from what you hear religious people say today, which is, oh, well, now that people don't believe in God, they've started to come up with other little dumb, crazy things to replace him. Now, I think that's largely true. The problem is that if you are a religious person and you make that argument and then you take that as a sufficient reason to be religious, then I think, you're either a brutal utilitarian or you're a dum-dum. Because just that religion was useful for keeping people seemingly sane in many cases does not make it true. Becker, in another place in the book, says the neurotic is having trouble with the balance of cultural illusion and natural reality. That is, human culture is in conflict with natural reality. Human culture involves the sustenance of an illusion. To participate successfully in human culture means participating in a mass illusion that is in conflict with natural reality. The neurotic is having trouble with this. He's having trouble with the balance of cultural illusion and natural reality. Becker goes on, the possible, horrible truth about himself and the world is seeping into his consciousness. The possible horrible truth about himself and the world is seeping into his consciousness. What makes a person neurotic is not, by Becker's estimation, that he is in denial. What makes a person neurotic is that he has started to lose his denial. He has started, against his will, to believe in the truth. And the truth is a terrible, terrible thing to believe in. I think I will stop for the main feed here. Yeah, I've got a lot more Becker to get to, but I think I will stop there. And then in the secret show, we will talk some about Becker's proposals for solutions, his discussion of what solutions might look like, some of his self-contradictory statements about mental health, his arguments about Christianity, about art, the artist, about the fundamental paradox of psychotherapy, and his own strange concluding note of self-delusion, as well as maybe talking a little bit about that Peter Sapfa essay, The Last Messiah, which I think is extremely relevant here. And I'll talk a little bit about my own experience of some of this stuff, because I think I could not help but do so while reading this fucking book. Go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, sign up for the secret show, put your email address in, I'll give you a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. Write to me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com if you would like a hookup. Sign up to be a motherfucker of the arts, or go to SLEERICKETS.com to the upper right-hand corner and click on Chip In. I don't know if it's located in a different place if you go on your phone. You can donate directly to the show to support things. But yeah, I will be back with more Becker, with more of all of the related texts soon. And I'm going to also have a whole episode about, probably 2 episodes about Brian's book and The Razor's Edge. But yeah, there's a lot more to get to. Oh, and Tara Isabella Burton too had a extremely revealing post I wanted to get to. So too much as always. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.